Russia makes gains in the east as the conflict in Ukraine continues with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. The United Nations says there have been about 4,400 civilian deaths and 5,500 injuries in Ukraine since the conflict with Russia began on February 24th. Nearly 4 months later, after initially fending off Russia in the west, Ukraine is reportedly running low on ammunition while struggling to repel Russian forces trying to capture the wider Donbas region, including Luhansk and the embattled city of Severodonetsk. CGTN's Michael Voss filed this report from Kyiv.
With all the bridges now destroyed, the Ukrainian army and those remaining civilians inside Severodonetsk are now essentially trapped there. Russia says it will open a humanitarian corridor to allow the civilians to leave. They would then be taken deeper into the Russian-controlled Luhansk region. Russia has also said that it will allow the Ukrainian troops there to surrender, but there's no sign yet that that's going on. Still very heavy street fighting going on. The Russians control about 80% of the city. The Ukrainians are mainly in the industrial area on the edge, including this large chemical plant where several hundred civilians are also said to be sheltering there. This is Russia's main target at the moment, Severodonetsk. If they can take this industrial city and its twin sister city town across the river, Lysychansk, they would then have complete control over the whole of the Luhansk region, which would allow President Putin to declare at least a partial victory. Heavy losses on both sides. It appears that the leader of the breakaway separatist Donetsk People's Republic has called on Russia for more reinforcements. President Zelensky is pushing the West to speed up the delivery of heavy weapons, particularly artillery and shells, because they're completely outgunned by the Russians. And the deputy defense minister here has said that her country has only received 10% of the weapons they asked their Western allies to deliver, and that if West doesn't step up its help, then there is a risk they could lose the war. There are now reports that Russia has sent 2 battalions of elite troops to reinforce the northern borders with Ukraine. One lot is on the Belarusian border near Sumy, right at the north, and then east-northeast of the capital, Kyiv, near Chernihiv. Whether Russia has the ability to open a second front when it's concentrating so hard on trying to take the Donbas area is very open to question. It may well be that what they're trying to do is to deter Ukraine from sending reinforcements down to the heavy fighting in the east. Michael Voss, CGTN, Kyiv.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Mark Sleboda is an international affairs and security analyst. Klaus Larres is a European affairs analyst and professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Also with us is Anton Fedyashin. He's a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University, right here in Washington, D.C. And Sergiy Kudelia is a Ukrainian Research in Switzerland fellow at the University of Basel and a political science professor at Baylor University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Sergiy Kudelia, let me start with you. As we just heard from our reporter, there's still a very volatile situation in eastern Ukraine, as he pointed out. Heavy street fighting taking place in some parts in the east. What is your assessment of the military situation there? Because we're also hearing that up to 200 Ukrainian troops are losing their lives every day this battle continues.
Well, the situation is very challenging and complex for the Ukrainian side. There is a very significant risk of encirclement of a large military contingent of Ukrainians in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Although I have to say that the capture of the entire Luhansk region is far from certain at this point. Lysychansk is located on the other side of the river from Severodonetsk. and it may be quite challenging for the Russians to capture this city in the next couple of weeks. But there is certainly an advantage, at least in terms of the artillery. Russians have, and that gives them that necessary impetus in terms of their advance on the Ukrainian positions. It is also important to remember that a large part of Donetsk Oblast is still in Ukrainian control. Major towns like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, like Pokrovsk, these towns are fully under Ukrainian control.
Right.
And that gives at least some hope for many Ukrainians that we will maintain the defense lines around the cities and prevent Russians from fully capturing Donbas. But it will certainly require a lot of support from the Western allies, and that is why over the last several days we've heard significant appeals from the Ukrainian authorities to increase the provision of heavy military equipment to the Ukrainian side.
Right, Serhiy, given these heavy losses that we were talking about, what is the political situation in Ukraine? Does President Zelensky have universal support to continue this war, this conflict?
There is really no significant change in terms of popular support for Zelensky. I think the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians have trust in Zelensky's leadership. And Zelensky really is the only politician, serious politician now in Ukraine, who makes daily appeals to the Ukrainian public. He dominates the airwaves, he dominates television. And I think from this standpoint, the leadership of Zelensky is quite solid.
Mark Sleboda, great to have you on the show. Russian forces, as we've just heard, have destroyed the last bridge to the city of Severodonetsk. They trapped any people who remain there. And as we also heard, Ukrainian forces are vastly outgunned by the Russians. What does this conflict look like from the Russian point of view?
Well, I'm afraid you have been already misreported some events. The last bridge from Severodonetsk to Lysychansk was destroyed by the Kyiv regime forces to prevent the surrender or the retreat of their own forces back across the bridge into Lysychansk. The Russian military forces have always been careful so far in this conflict to employ what Sun Tzu called the Golden Bridge tactic, which is to always provide your opponent with a means of retreat so that they don't attempt to fight to the death. They certainly intended to in this situation as well, but the regime is dead set on having its conscripts fight to the death in a situation that they hope to repeat the long delay of that occurred in Azovstal, as the Kyiv regime's state-armed and funded neo-Nazi battalions, Azov held out there for, over a month in the underground Cold War era network of bunkers and defenses there. But otherwise, there are movements all along the greater cauldron in the Donbas area. Zolota today was also completely enveloped in a cauldron. And we have seen advances up to the very perimeter of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, where the uprising against the Kyiv Putsch regime, which seized power in 2014, first occurred. So it's very symbolic to the people of East Ukraine who are allied in the fight with Russia against the West-backed regime forces in the area.
Right. Mark, we have been talking about the casualties on the Ukrainian side, and as our reporter told us, there have been heavy losses on both sides. How big a toll has Russia been taking here?
Well, I certainly think that the toll of the Russian armed forces would be more than they hoped for at the beginning of the conflict, but it is still a marginal percentage that the Kyiv regime forces. And that's because largely the conflict at this point has become a grinding attrition conflict of artillery, heavy artillery. The Kyiv regime forces have embedded themselves within their own cities in an attempt to provide cover, and it is resulting in mass destruction, but without any serious means of replying back The Kyiv regime has already seen over some 500 multiple launch rocket systems and 1,000 artillery pieces, actually close to 2,000 artillery pieces destroyed since the beginning of the conflict. And that is a result of the superior firepower of the Russian forces, as well as air dominance, near total air superiority over the front line of the conflict. So
Right.
they're really just hunkered in, trying to survive at this point.
Klaus Larres, good to see you. Klaus, we are hearing that Ukraine is running short, running low on weapons, but we've just also heard from the United States Pentagon on Tuesday that a meeting will take place, a meeting with 50 countries attending will take place on Wednesday in Brussels to talk about supplying more weapons to Ukraine as well as other kinds of equipment. President Zelensky, for his part, has been talking about what he thinks is President Putin's objective in this conflict. Let's listen to some of what President Zelensky had to say.
Russia wants to ruin European unity, wants to leave Europe divided, and wants to leave it weak. All of Europe is a target for Russia. Ukraine is only the first stage in this aggression, in these plans.
So, Klaus, what do you make of that assessment?
He wants to go further than Ukraine is an open question, but that Russia has been for years interested in undermining Western and NATO unity is not very questionable. This is clearly, or has been, Putin's aim for many years. Whether he wants to go into Moldova or other countries beyond Ukraine, we really don't know. But he certainly wants to weaken Ukraine and ease Ukraine away from the Western alliance, clearly. I think tomorrow around about 40 countries will meet in Brussels to discuss whether or not more arms and stronger weaponry can be sent to Ukraine. I would assume that some decision which helps the Ukrainians to fight the onslaught by the Russians will be taken. But it is a very difficult and desperate situation for the Ukrainians who are fighting for their territory. At the same time, we can gradually notice there are divisions within the Western alliance coming up, particularly in the European Union. Countries such as Germany, France, and Italy are increasingly wondering whether the Ukrainians shouldn't be gently pushed into entering serious negotiations with the Russians and perhaps obtain a ceasefire on the basis of the current status quo, and then try to roll back Russian territory, which they have gained so far, at the negotiating table. This is strongly rejected by Ukraine and by most Eastern European countries, such as the Baltic states and Poland and other countries. And I think that division at the moment is being papered over. It hasn't really come into the open fully, but we can expect in the future that I think these questions will be increasingly asked, whether or not it's time to stop the war and then try to obtain a better solution at the bargaining and negotiating table rather than on the battlefield.
Klaus, the Europeans may have their view on this, but isn't the key what Washington will say and thinks about this, not what Brussels thinks?
Absolutely. And so far, the United States and the Biden administration is rejecting the ideas the Germans, the French, and the Italians are thinking about. But I think this is only a matter of time when also the United States will weaken a little in its support for Ukraine. Not in its support for Ukraine, that's perhaps wrong, but they will be desperate to overcome the war. They will want to stop the bloodshed and the brutality, and also, of course, the global economic consequences and the food crisis which we see all over the world. And I think in due course the United States may also wonder whether the war shouldn't be finished at some relatively early stage, and may gradually side with the Germans and the French and the Italians. We don't know for sure, but there is some sort of rethinking going on in the Western alliance. And I think that is why Zelensky is increasingly frantically appealing for weapons and for support. He needs it on the battleground, but he also needs the moral and political support. And I think he fears that that may be slipping, that the West is tiring of its support, is tiring of the war. Hopefully that is not the case, but one purpose.
Anton Fedyashin, good to see you, Anton. What is your view? Do you think there is some kind of rethinking, some reassessment of where this conflict goes now as far as the Europeans and the Americans are concerned?
As far as the Europeans are concerned, Anand, definitely. There's a reason why the Italian four-point plan for the negotiated end for the war was leaked to the press, over a week ago now, and has been sent into circulation. So yes, I agree with Klaus completely. Predictably, the Germans, the French, and the Italians, who have the most to lose economically from the sanctions and the war itself, they are beginning to have second thoughts. Moreover, look, countries such as Denmark and Holland, who have been very supportive of Ukraine, understandably so, through this disaster, but they are having serious doubts about Ukraine's path into the EU, or at least the sped up path into the EU. So they're second guessing on many levels, and I think Klaus is right that the United States is behind that curve right now, but ultimately, if things go the way they're going right now, the United States will sooner or later come around to the West European perspective.
Right. Anton, the Washington Post, which has been very critical of President Putin, the Washington Post has reported that Russia will seize control of Ukraine's eastern region within weeks, the newspaper says. So right now, are we at some kind of stalemate?
No, we're not at a stalemate. The Russians are very slowly but methodically rolling towards the original official administrative border of Luhansk that Sergiy addressed, and Donetsk eventually. I think that once they take Severodonetsk and fill in the Luhansk province, which may take some time, they're then going to throw all of their effort at Donetsk, and then we're looking at weeks more of fighting. It certainly looks like they are planning to either recognize the independence or to annex, either short-term or long-term, the Zaporozhye and the Kherson areas, or regions, rather. There's been a lot of activity on the ground with Russian phone cards being handed out, passports, with Russian currency being introduced into circulation. It certainly doesn't look like they are planning to even trade those two regions off, and the rest of eastern Ukraine we'll have to see about. But to be honest with you, Anand, I don't think the Russians will have the wherewithal to continue a major and acutely military campaign for the rest of eastern Ukraine into the summer. But again, war is such a contingent thing that it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Sergiy Kudelia, there have been reports that officials in Kyiv are concerned that the West might be experiencing something known as war fatigue right now, which might be prompting the kinds of things that we've been hearing about there being a reassessment, a rethinking of where this conflict goes to right now. But how concerned are Ukrainians that Western resolve might be weakening?
Well, the West has already made significant investments in this war. And they made significant public commitments to support Ukraine. So if the West, and specifically the Europeans, as some of the commentators just said, may change their mind, they will have to pay a significant price with their domestic voters, with their domestic audience. And so it will be politically costly for the Germans, for example, or for the Italians to reverse their public stance. They will look weak for their voters, and I don't think either Macron or Scholz would want to look weak in front of their voters and their societies. So I think it's not going to be that easy for the Europeans to suddenly change their tune and reverse their position on the provision of significant military assistance to Ukraine.
Right, but
and
yes, right. Those voters that you talk about in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France, they're already paying, aren't they? They're paying increased energy costs right now. They're paying more for their goods because of inflation.
Yes, and the energy costs are not only rising because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. There are many factors that lead to the rise in the energy costs. But at the same time, it does not mean that the countries have to stop supporting Ukrainian effort to fight the Russians back. I do not think there is any public support for the defeat of the Ukrainians within the European countries. There is overwhelming support for Ukraine and for Ukrainian independence in Europe.
Mark Sleboda, we've heard from both sides that this conflict will eventually end. It will eventually be resolved through negotiation, through some kind of diplomatic agreement. And of course, both sides will probably make concessions in this agreement. But for Russia, how does it end? When will Russia say that, look, we've achieved our aims, it's time to stop?
Yeah, I think that we're looking at a conflict that will likely rage for months, possibly years, into the future. All of these Western arms, as NATO empties its own stockpiles to fight a proxy war against Russia, they are only ensuring that the Kremlin must go on, providing Harpoon anti-ship missiles to the Kyiv regime. Practically guarantees that the Russian military must take Odessa. They must protect their fleet in the Black Sea, so they will have to take Odessa and all the Black Sea coast. Similarly, with essentially the Kyiv regime's military has already been destroyed. They are begging for another NATO-trained, NATO-funded, NATO-armed army to be magically created in West Ukraine to continue the fight. They are plugging the gaps that are failing in East Ukraine with the territorial defense battalions, and they are on the third wave of their massed forced conscription of their own people, including even a certain percentage of women, that they're trying to throw into this fight as cannon fodder between the regime and the Russian and allied Donbas forces. This conflict will continue. I think that Russia's ultimate goals are only increasing as time and resistance goes on, because let's be frank about this. Russia is winning the war on the battlefield handily. Once this these redoubts that have been built up over 8 years have been defeated in the Donbas and Luhansk administrative regions. There are no comparable defenses anywhere else in Ukraine at this level. You can't just assemble them on a moment. And all of the Kyiv regime's best military forces, their most ideological far-right battalions, will have been ground down by attrition into nothing.
Okay.
So this is going to continue. Russians' demands are going to increase, and they're also seeing themselves winning the economic war.
Okay.
Right? The blowback from sanctions are having a much, much greater effect, while the ruble is stronger than it was at the beginning of this conflict, and the inflation rate in Russia, the weekly inflation for several weeks now has been slashed to zero.
Right, Klaus Larres, talking about sanctions that were imposed in Russia, there was a headline in Tuesday's New York Times, and that headline read, "Russia's oil revenue soars despite sanctions." That's from a study by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Here is President Putin. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Europe giving up Russian energy is highly improbable in the next several years, and there's no way to know what happens next in these next few years. So nobody is going to lay concrete on the drillings. There's no need. Worst case, what it could lead to is what's going on now. The amount of oil in the international market is shrinking and prices are rising, and that's that. And corporate profits are growing in money terms.
So, Klaus, have these sanctions failed, or if I could put it another way, have they failed to achieve what they were intended to do?
Well, they haven't failed, but Russia has overcome the sanctions to surprisingly large degrees. This is true, and of course the rising oil price has benefited Putin. Though they sell less oil, they actually obtain more revenues because the price has become higher. But when you look at other parts of the Russian economy, for example, semiconductors, computer technology, also spare parts for Nord Stream 1, which they can't get anymore, and therefore they say they have to cut down Nord Stream 1 by 40%, oil delivery rivalries to Germany are affected. That all indicates the long-term consequences for the Russian economy will be most severe. The Russians may be doing okay now, the ruble may be strong now, doesn't mean the ruble will be strong and the economy will be strong or doing okay in only a few weeks' time. And also I would be less convinced that Russia has clearly already won the war, as the previous speaker said. I think we really don't know. The Russians do have the upper hand right now in the Donbas, but that doesn't mean they will continue to have the upper hand. Western heavy weaponry will come to help the Ukrainians, and we should not underestimate the will and motivation of the Ukrainians to fight back the aggressor. I think the real danger is European and Western public opinion, whether they have the stamina to continue the war in view of rising prices and a weakened economy. That, I think, is the question. Think of the Vietnam War many years ago. The Vietnam War was not lost by the United States on the battlefield. It was essentially lost at home because the American public didn't support it anymore. And of course, you can't compare the situation. Domestic opinion is highly important, not least in Europe.
Anton, I've just got a little bit of time left, a couple of minutes. And on the question of what President Putin is seeking, he recently talked about his admiration for Peter the Great, and he compared the situation to the Great Northern War. What should we read into this comparison?
Well, I think that the one thing that this comparison has, not brought to light, as many commentators have written lately, is that, it's uncovered some kind of plot to seize more territory. That was already clear before the Peter the Great comment. What I see in this is the emergence of Russia as a great power. Again, that is exactly what the Northern War brought for Peter the Great. It turned Muscovy, of which he was Tsar, into the Russian Empire, of which he became emperor right at the end of the Great Northern War in 1721. Ironically, the turning point in that war came in July of 1709 on the territory of what is today Ukraine at Poltava, where the Russians defeated the most advanced army of Europe at the time, and those were the Swedes, led by a very gifted, if mercurial, leader, Charles XII. But the great difference that I see here is that back in the beginning of the 18th century, and for Peter the Great himself, great power status meant the need for modernization, and the need for modernization meant Westernization. There were simply no alternatives in the beginning of the 1700s. Boy, have times changed, because these days, great power status still means modernization, economically and otherwise, militarily certainly, but it no longer hinges on Westernization, and West is no longer the single reference point for the planet. And this brings us back to a conversation we've had on several occasions about the changing nature of globalization in today's world.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.